One of the biggest misconceptions about empaths is that they are shy, insecure, or somehow uncomfortable being seen. People often assume that if someone isn't constantly posting updates, sharing selfies, documenting every achievement, or broadcasting every emotional experience, it must mean they're lacking confidence. But psychology suggests something very different. In many cases, the empath's reluctance to live publicly has less to do with fear and more to do with value. Empaths tend to experience human connection differently than most people. They are often less interested in being noticed and more interested in being understood. That's an important distinction. Social media platforms are largely built around visibility. The system rewards attention, engagement, and performance. The more people react to you, the more the platform amplifies you. But for an empath, attention and connection are not the same thing. An empath can receive thousands of likes and still feel disconnected. At the same time, a single meaningful conversation with someone they trust can feel more fulfilling than weeks of online validation. Their psychological reward system is often tied less to external approval and more to emotional authenticity. They aren't asking, "How many people saw me?" They're asking, "Did anyone genuinely understand me?" This creates an interesting conflict with modern culture. We live in a time where visibility is often mistaken for significance. Many people unconsciously measure their worth through audience size, engagement rates, or social recognition. The message is subtle but constant. If people aren't watching, then what you're doing must not matter. Yet empaths tend to resist this idea naturally. Why? Because they understand something many people learn only after years of disappointment. Being seen is not the same as being valued. Being admired is not the same as being loved. And being followed is not the same as being known. Psychologically speaking, highly empathic individuals are often skilled at detecting emotional incongruence. They notice when someone is presenting an image rather than expressing a reality. They can often sense the difference between genuine confidence and carefully constructed, validation-seeking behavior. As a result, many empaths become skeptical of environments where image management becomes more important than authentic self-expression. That doesn't mean empaths dislike social media. Many use it. Many enjoy it. Some even build successful platforms and communities. The difference is in their motivation. They are less likely to view social media as a source of identity, and more likely to view it as a tool. They don't need constant feedback to know who they are. Their sense of self tends to come from internal alignment rather than external applause. Think about it this way. If a person's self-worth depends entirely on other people's reactions, then every compliment becomes a necessity, and every criticism becomes a threat. Life turns into a constant negotiation with public opinion. But empaths often recognize this trap early. They understand that when your identity becomes dependent on external validation, you slowly surrender ownership of yourself. Philosophically, this reflects a deeper truth about human fulfillment. The strongest forms of confidence are usually quiet. They don't demand witnesses. They don't require an audience. Real confidence is the ability to maintain your sense of value, whether people applaud you or ignore you. It's the ability to continue growing even when nobody is paying attention. This is why many empaths invest so much energy into private experiences. They would rather strengthen a relationship than perform one. They would rather enjoy a meaningful moment than interrupt it to prove it happened. They would rather become something remarkable than spend years convincing people they already are. And perhaps that's what makes them seem different in a world obsessed with exposure. While others are chasing recognition, the empath is often chasing understanding. While others are building an image, the empath is building a life. And while others are asking to be seen, the empath is asking a far more important question. Am I living in a way that feels true to who I really am? Because in the end, the people who know their worth don't. They spend their lives trying to prove it. They spend their lives living it. Once you understand that empaths value authentic connection over public validation, another piece of the puzzle begins to make sense. Many empaths don't avoid social media because they dislike people. They avoid excessive exposure because they understand something about themselves that most people never fully recognize. Their emotional system is highly responsive to the emotional environments around them. For most people, scrolling through social media feels like a simple activity. It's entertainment, information, distraction, or connection. But for an empath, the experience can be much more complex. Every post carries emotional content. Every argument, celebration, complaint, tragedy, success story, and expression of anger transmits emotional information. The empath is not simply processing words and images, they are often processing emotional states. Psychology has long recognized that human beings are influenced by emotional contagion, the tendency to absorb and mirror the feelings of those around us. When someone enters a room full of anxious people, their own anxiety often rises. When they spend time with optimistic individuals, their mood frequently improves. Empaths experience this process with greater intensity. Their awareness of emotional cues tends to be heightened, making them particularly sensitive to the emotional atmosphere surrounding them. What makes social media unique is that it exposes people to hundreds or even thousands of emotional environments in a single day. Within minutes, someone can move from a heartbreaking story to a political argument, from a motivational quote to a public humiliation, from a celebration to a crisis. The nervous system was never designed to process such an enormous volume of emotional input at this speed. Yet this has become normal for many people. Empaths often discover that what others consider harmless scrolling leaves them feeling emotionally exhausted. They may not even understand why at first. They simply notice that after spending significant time online, they feel drained, overwhelmed, distracted, or emotionally heavy. This isn't weakness, it's awareness. Many empaths eventually realize that their emotional energy is one of their most valuable resources. They begin to recognize that every environment they enter leaves an imprint on their mental state. The digital world is no exception. In fact, one of the most overlooked realities of modern life is that attention itself is a form of energy investment. Wherever your attention goes, a portion of your psychological resources follows. When you repeatedly focus on conflict, outrage, fear, comparison, and negativity, those emotional experiences begin occupying space inside your mind, whether you consciously choose them or not. Empaths are often among the first people to recognize this pattern because they feel the emotional effects more intensely. As a result, many of them become highly selective about what they consume. They are not trying to isolate themselves from the world. They are trying to maintain psychological clarity. They understand that constant exposure to emotional chaos eventually creates internal chaos. This is where boundaries become important. Most people think of boundaries as something that exists only in relationships. They imagine saying no to toxic individuals or limiting contact with unhealthy people. But mature empaths learn that boundaries must also exist in digital spaces. They begin treating their attention with the same care they would treat their physical health. They understand that not every debate deserves participation. Not every controversy deserves attention. Not every emotional storm deserves entry into their inner world. And this requires a level of discipline that many people underestimate. The modern world encourages endless consumption. Algorithms compete aggressively for attention, because attention has become one of the most valuable currencies in existence. The longer someone remains emotionally activated, the longer they stay engaged. The longer they stay engaged, the more profitable they become. Empaths often sense this dynamic intuitively. They recognize that many digital platforms are designed not necessarily to create peace, but to capture focus. As a result, they begin stepping back. They become more intentional about where they invest their awareness. To an outside observer, this withdrawal may appear antisocial. It may seem like disinterest or detachment, but in reality, it is often the opposite. The empath is protecting the very qualities that allow them to connect deeply in the first place: presence, compassion, clarity, and emotional balance. Because if you constantly allow the noise of the world into your mind, eventually it becomes difficult to hear your own thoughts. If you absorb every emotional signal around you, eventually you lose touch with your own emotional truth. The wisest empaths understand that protecting your peace is not selfish. It is a responsibility, because the quality of your life is ultimately determined by the quality of what you allow into your mind. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not disconnect from people, but disconnect from the noise that prevents you from truly hearing yourself. As empaths become more aware of how emotional environments affect them, they often arrive at another realization, one that fundamentally changes how they view visibility, attention, and public exposure. They begin to understand that the more visible a person becomes, the more they become a screen onto which other people project their own emotions, insecurities, assumptions, and unresolved issues. This is one of the least discussed realities of human psychology. Most people assume that when someone criticizes, praises, envies, or idolizes another person, those reactions are entirely about the person being observed. But in reality, much of human perception is projection. People often see others not as they truly are, but as reflections of their own beliefs, fears, desires, and emotional states. Empaths tend to recognize this earlier than most because they spend a great deal of time observing human behavior. They notice how two people can look at the exact same individual and arrive at completely different conclusions. One person sees confidence and calls it arrogance. Another sees the same behavior and calls it leadership. One person sees independence and calls it strength. Another sees it and calls it selfishness. The person being observed hasn't changed. The observer has. What changes is the lens through which reality is interpreted. This becomes especially important in the world of social media, because social media magnifies projection on a massive scale. When people encounter a photograph, a video, a status update, or a carefully selected moment from someone's life, they rarely see the full person behind it. Instead, they fill in the gaps with assumptions drawn from their own experiences. Someone who struggles with insecurity may assume confidence is fake. Someone carrying resentment may interpret success as luck. Someone desperate for validation may assume attention equals happiness. In each case, they are not reacting to reality itself. They are reacting to their interpretation of reality. Empaths often understand this dynamic instinctively. Because of their heightened awareness of emotional patterns, they recognize that public visibility inevitably attracts misunderstandings. The larger the audience becomes, the more interpretations emerge. Some people will admire you for qualities you don't even recognize in yourself. Others will criticize you for intentions you never had. Some will create stories about who you are without ever knowing you at all. And perhaps the most psychologically exhausting part is that none of it can be fully controlled. Many people spend years trying to manage public perception. They attempt to explain themselves perfectly, present themselves flawlessly, and eliminate every possible misunderstanding. Yet no matter how carefully they do this, projection remains unavoidable. Empaths often discover a profound truth here. If you spend your life trying to control how others perceive you, you eventually lose control of how you perceive yourself. Think about the emotional cost of constantly monitoring how people might interpret your words, your choices, your appearance, or your success. Over time, this creates a form of psychological dependence. Instead of acting from authenticity, people begin acting from anticipation. They stop asking, "What feels true to me?" and start asking, "How will this be received?" That shift may seem small, but it changes everything. The moment external perception becomes the primary guide for behavior, personal freedom begins to disappear. This is why many empaths choose privacy, not because they fear judgment, but because they understand the limitations of public understanding. They know that no amount of explanation can force someone to see reality clearly if that person is determined to see it through the lens of their own wounds, biases, or expectations. There is a certain wisdom in accepting this. Mature empaths learn that not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every criticism deserves a response. Not every false assumption needs to be challenged. Sometimes, the healthiest choice is to allow people to hold their opinions while remaining grounded in your own truth. This doesn't come from indifference. It comes from emotional maturity. It comes from realizing that your identity cannot be built on the shifting perceptions of strangers. Public opinion changes constantly. Today's praise becomes tomorrow's criticism. Today's admiration becomes tomorrow's disappointment. If your sense of self rises and falls with those fluctuations, stability becomes impossible. The strongest empaths understand that peace begins where the need for universal approval ends. They recognize that true self-awareness is not the ability to make everyone understand you. It is the ability to remain connected to who you are, even when they don't. And when you stop trying to control every projection others place upon you, something remarkable happens. You reclaim the energy that was meant for your own growth, your own purpose, and your own life. Because freedom begins the moment you realize that your responsibility is not to manage every perception, but to live so authentically that perception no longer controls you. When you put all of this together, the empath's preference for authentic connection over validation, their sensitivity to emotional environments, and their understanding of projection, you begin to see why many of the most powerful empaths choose a path that looks very different from what modern culture encourages. Instead of building their lives in public, they build them quietly. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the empath mindset. In a world that rewards visibility, silence is often mistaken for absence. If someone isn't constantly posting, updating, sharing, announcing, or promoting themselves, people assume nothing significant is happening. But some of the most important transformations in human life occur far away from public attention. Growth is usually invisible before it becomes visible. A tree develops its roots long before anyone notices its height. Strength develops long before it is tested. Wisdom develops long before it is recognized. The same principle applies to people. The most meaningful forms of personal development often happen in private moments that never appear on a screen. Empaths tend to understand this naturally because they are often more interested in substance than appearance. They care less about looking successful and more about becoming successful. Less about appearing wise and more about acquiring wisdom. Less about projecting confidence and more about building genuine self-trust. This creates a fundamentally different relationship with achievement. Many people feel pressure to document every milestone. The moment something positive happens, there is an urge to share it, display it, and receive validation for it. There is nothing inherently wrong with that, but empaths often experience fulfillment differently. They don't always feel the need to convert every meaningful experience into public content. For them, some moments are valuable precisely because they remain personal. There is a psychological principle that helps explain this. External rewards can sometimes weaken internal motivation. When people become overly focused on recognition, applause, and approval, they may gradually lose touch with the deeper reasons they began pursuing something in the first place. Empaths are often sensitive to this shift. They recognize that when every achievement becomes a performance, it can become difficult to separate genuine fulfillment from public reaction. The focus slowly moves away from growth itself and toward how growth is perceived by others. This is why many highly evolved empaths become protective of their private development. They understand that not everything valuable needs an audience. Some goals grow stronger when they are nurtured quietly. Some dreams gain momentum when they are protected from excessive outside influence. There is also another layer to this that deserves attention. Empaths often possess a heightened awareness of human nature. They understand that success attracts attention, but attention is not always supportive. Sometimes it attracts comparison, sometimes envy, sometimes expectations, sometimes pressure. As a result, they become selective about what they reveal and when they reveal it, not because they are hiding, but because they understand timing. A seed does not announce itself before it has developed roots. It grows first, then it emerges. The strongest empaths often approach life in the same way. They focus on becoming rather than announcing. They focus on building rather than broadcasting. They understand that real transformation requires periods of solitude, reflection, and uninterrupted growth. And perhaps this is why they often appear calm in situations where others feel anxious. Their confidence is not built on constant reinforcement from the outside world. It is built on evidence, accumulated through private effort. They know what they have overcome. They know the lessons they have learned. They know the discipline they have practiced when nobody was watching. That kind of confidence is remarkably stable because it is rooted in experience rather than attention. Philosophically, this points to a deeper truth about human fulfillment. The modern world often encourages people to be known, but being known is not the same as knowing yourself. One is external, the other is internal. One depends on an audience, the other depends on awareness. Empaths who embrace quiet growth often discover that self-knowledge creates a level of peace that public recognition can never fully provide. They stop measuring their value by visibility. They stop measuring their progress by attention. Instead, they begin measuring life by alignment, how closely their actions reflect their deepest values. And that changes everything, because once your life becomes aligned with your values, you no longer need constant proof that you're moving in the right direction. The direction itself becomes the proof. So if you're someone who feels pressure to constantly show, explain, or prove yourself, remember this: the most important parts of your growth will never be visible to the crowd. The habits, decisions, sacrifices, and lessons that shape your future are often forged in private. And in the end, the people who make the greatest impact are rarely the ones who spend the most time being seen. They are the ones who spend the most time becoming who they were meant to be.